Diana Pasulka, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I'm very excited to speak to you, Diana. This is a subject that I have steered clear of for a long
Yes,
time.
me
Even
too.
though as a child, even though as a young kid, I was interested in the subject, so much so that I even told my dad on one occasion that I wanted to devote my life to pursuing UFOs, and he said, "Demetri, don't be stupid." He said something like that. So we're going to get into the subject. And I really want listeners who, regardless of where they fall on the spectrum, don't bring your biases into this and don't assume that we're having this conversation because we're looking to validate or invalidate any particular thing. This is largely exploratory to discuss a phenomenon that has pervaded the public consciousness and that is relevant, even if for only that fact. So, Diana, before we start, let's talk a little bit about you. Your bio says that you're a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where you teach about the history of the Catholic tradition and new religious movements, particularly as they intersect with digital technologies. If I were an undergraduate at UNCW today, what courses of yours would I be able to take that would teach me about the history of religious movements and how does technology factor into those histories?
Yes, that would be my general course, which is New Religious Movements. And it's a category within my field called Religious Studies. And I do want to say something about my field because a lot of people have misconceptions about it. So in religious studies, we are interdisciplinary. So we're archaeologists or, historians, and we come at the study of religion from an academic perspective. So we don't advocate for any religion. And we basically just teach about religions. Most people in the world are religious. So it's, look at what's happening in the world today. We have a lot of religious conflict. So religion is an important topic to learn about. That said, in our field, we don't make any truth claims about religion. We don't say this is real or not real. We study social effects. So I did want to do that qualification about what we study.
So that's a good point of clarification. It was actually something I was going to ask you. So you've described what you do as studying, quote, reports of miraculous events and afterlife worlds in studying reports of miraculous events and afterlife worlds in Christian history. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah. So in a lot of religions, not all of them, because there are atheist religions, but in many of the monotheistic religions, so you're talking about Judaism, Islam, Christianity, people believe that when they die, that's not the end, that they continue on. And they generally have ideas about what these places are, and they're called heaven, purgatory, hell, these locations. And so what I've done is I've explored how people at various times in history have thought about those. And for a long time I've looked at old ancient near-death experiences, because people have had them for a long time, for thousands of years. And also ideas about this place called purgatory, which Catholics believe in. Most Catholics, though, don't know what it is today. But it's been a tradition in that church for a long time. And so, I've looked at those traditions, and in our field, we call those other world journey traditions or ascent traditions, because they're also linked in other types of religions, like say Hinduism or Buddhism, with this idea of this ascent of a person's afterlife body, like their soul or something like that. And as it leaves their body, what happens to it. So that's what I've been focusing on in my studies mostly.
What do these experiences have in common with the UAP experience? What do they all share in common, in other words?
Yeah, sure. So okay, so first I have to say again that I was a person who's never interested in UFOs or UAPs. They're now called unidentified anomalous phenomena. And I wasn't interested in that. I had not seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind or anything like that. So in about 2012, what happened was that I had just finished a book on the topic of purgatory. Purgatory, again, is this afterlife destination for a person's soul who happens to be Catholic or Orthodox Christian. And what happened to that doctrine was that for Catholics worldwide, so global Catholics, we're talking about, a billion people, more than a billion people, it flew off the map, basically. So whereas people, my grandmother or a lot of people that I know, their grandparents and great grandparents, they would actually do devotions and prayers for souls in purgatory to free them from being in purgatory so that they could go to heaven. Purgatory is this in between state where souls languish until they're purified enough to get into heaven. This is the idea. So I wanted to know what happened to that. So I'd done a long study on that and wrote a survey book that was published with Oxford University Press. And after that, what I had done was I had come upon a bunch of reports in the Catholic record, because I do research in archives, which is basically looking at really old texts in libraries devoted to old texts, which are called archives. So I would be in archives and I would come across a Catholic from, say, 1400 who saw what they thought was, this spinning disc in the sky and maybe some, things associated with it. And they would interpret it in different ways. One of the ways they interpreted it was that these were souls from purgatory that needed to be prayed back into purgatory because they were lost or something like this. So I made notes of these. And what I noticed was that in the descriptions were similar. The descriptions were always very similar. So it would be something like a shiny disc in the sky. It would come down. Sometimes it would interact with people. The people would, think that it was not ordinary at all. And they would, do something like I said, pray it back or something, or try to get rid of it in some way. So I didn't actually think about, I didn't know what these were, but I kept a log of them. So as I was doing my book on purgatory, I kept a log of these, extraneous, strange reports. And at the end of my research in that, I had a log of these reports and I kept them, but I wasn't going to do anything with them. I just thought that they were odd. And I sent in my manuscript and it was published. And I showed a friend of mine these reports. And I said, what do you think of these? And he read through them and he said, this really reminds me of Steven Spielberg, UFOs. And really, I thought he was crazy. I said, that's crazy. You are, off your rocker. But strangely enough, there was a UFO conference in my town that week. And I went to it and I listened to people and they were talking about the same thing. So we're talking about people who are saying the same things that people say 500 years ago would say in European, in France or something, Catholics in France. They would see this thing in the sky. It would come down. They would have some type of interaction with it and they would have these ideas about it, and they would generally look at it like something spiritual. And so when I was listening to people at the UFO conference, they were saying the exact same thing. They were saying, well, this thing came down from the sky and I had this interaction with it and my life completely changed and this is how I feel about it. And they were speaking in terms that were religious like. And I recognized that right away as a pattern. And more patterns emerged as I started to study it. And honestly, I didn't actually want to study it because, this is like a career breaker for a lot of people who begin to study it. John Mack comes to mind. He's a Harvard psychiatrist who studied this in the 80s and the 90s. And he was at Harvard, and they actually did an investigation into his research. They found that he was completely legit. So I was aware of this. I wouldn't have undertaken this study if I had been an assistant professor or an associate professor, but I was already a full professor. I was the chair of my department. I had won the research, awards at my university. I had won lots and lots of grant money. So I was already pretty established. So I wasn't really concerned that much with the credibility hit that it would take. But so I began to research this, and this is how it happened.
I think it probably also helped you that you were coming in from the angle of being a religious scholar, because people have an understanding that what you're studying is it's not necessarily a scientific phenomenon or something that can be investigated scientifically, but something that really speaks to people's experience and perception. But what's interesting about the UAP phenomenon is it kind of intersects. It's an intersection between both of these. It's on the one hand something that requires faith in some sense, but it also is something that you can empirically investigate. So that's something I do want to get into. But I have a couple of questions, and I do want to go back to ask one more question about your relevant experience as someone that studies religion and religious experiences. When you were when you were reading the Bible and you were reading other historical accounts in antiquity where people saw things in the sky, these things came down, they interacted with them, was there a common interpretation across all of those stories for what those things were at the time? And was there a moral dimension to those interpretations at the time?
Yes, those are great questions. And those are okay. So I'm going to answer both of them. Okay. So the first question you asked, and it will be actually a surprising answer that I give. The one pattern that was common to historical reports of anomalous aerial phenomena and contemporary reports is that people are absolutely surprised by what they see. They're surprised, and then they go through a number of steps to try to fit what they see into their own cultural framework. Okay. And that happens regardless of if it's 1,000 years ago or if it's today. It's that, even pilots today, I talk to pilots today, and they'll see, and by the way, pilots have a lot of sightings, and they'll see something, and immediately they'll be absolutely taken, by surprise, because it doesn't conform to any of the planes they know of, or, drones, or, things that are out there. And back in the day, it was the same case. So you have the case of, I'll take Teresa of Avila. She's a nun from the 16th century in Spain. And she's going about her day, and she sees this thing that she's first surprised by it. She doesn't know what it is. It's a being, actually, and it's about 3 feet tall. And she says, this has to be an angel, because what else could it be? So she's really confused by it. And you can see that she's trying to interpret it within her own framework of Catholicism, and she can't, but she does. And then the people that write about it afterwards, because she's a famous, actually, person in the Catholic Church. She's a doctor of the church. Her interpretation gets completely changed over time. And the people who are responsible for interpreting her event say, well, she imagined this. It wasn't actually real, right? And this is when people believed in stuff more than we believe in things, right? They're not materialists. They believe in spiritual things, but even they could not fit it into their spiritual narrative. So a lot of times these things break our conceptions that we've inherited, no matter if it's 1,000 years ago or today. So that's the first answer to your question. So there is a common element, and that's this element of narrative breaking, events happening here. The second is, okay, that was a long answer to your question. Can you repeat the second question that you had?
My question was, one, how did they interpret these events? These contact events. And the second was, were there moral dimensions to these events? Because you just described them as angelic beings a moment ago. Was there a tendency to see them as beneficent? Was there a tendency in some cases to see them as malevolent? I'm trying to understand that.
Okay, that's a really good question too. So when people try to identify them as, these beings that are non-ordinary, if they lived 1,000 years ago, even heck, 150 years ago, they most likely are going to look at these within the tradition of non-human intelligences, which include angels, demons, that type of thing. That's the interpretive framework that they had then. So even if they interpret them as angels, those angels sometimes are not friendly. They don't seem friendly, and people are frightened by them. And you can even see this in the biblical text. Jacob in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, he has a struggle all night long with this angel, right? And the angel doesn't treat him very nicely. It's like a fight that they're having. When Gabriel in the New Testament shows up to Mary, to tell her that she's with child, Mary's frightened because he says, "Do not be afraid," because her first inclination is to be afraid. So this is a common element, is fear. So the moral dimension, I would say, is something that we ascribe to them. I wouldn't
Mm,
say it's inherently within what they're seeing. That's my
mm.
opinion, though. But
What
based on what I've studied from modern reports and early reports, I don't think there's an objectively inherent goodness or badness. There are some good and bad effects that humans have after they experience this, but I don't know if these are inherent to the phenomena itself.
What's interesting when we're talking about perception here is when you look at I mean, what are there, like thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of cataloged encounter experiences going back to antiquity. When you look at these, some of these experiences, what you find is among people that are in a group who are having a common experience, where they're all at the same time witnessing something. You have different people seeing something in a different way, perceiving the same thing
Mhm.
differently. That's also something that I think is relevant that I want to talk to. But I have one last question about your background. So, what has your work taught you about how people come to believe in certain things, where those beliefs emerge from, and what influences them and in their belief structures?
Yeah, so that's really a good. This is exactly what I focus on in my study. Uh, what I focus on here is how we interface with really popular culture is one way to put it. Like 15 years ago, today we would call it digital technology, because most of the popular culture we consume through our screens. So when students come into my basic survey of most of the religions, okay, so the religious traditions, they actually know what they know, even about their own religion, for the most part. I would say 90% of them, through watching videos or films or anime or things like that, video games. Their knowledge and interpretation comes from visual culture, and visual culture's changed a lot. But it used to also be through visual culture. So let's talk about, since I'm most familiar with the Christian tradition. So in a thousand years ago in the Christian tradition, a lot of people didn't read. So they weren't reading the Bible. They weren't reading, books, things like that, but they were looking at scenes of the Bible in church. So they were looking at frescoes. So they were looking at visual culture. And also there were performances back then. So a lot of holy days actually were performances of scenes from the Bible and things like that. So people this is how people learned about their religion and their faith, and this is how they formed in frameworks for
Mm.
understanding, these kinds of things. We do the same thing today, but right now how we do it is through visual media, through entertainment media. And here's an example of this. So students of mine, they often go abroad, study abroad, and say they're sophomores or juniors, and they go to Italy or they go to France and they go to museums there. And they'll see these events from Catholic history, like say the Francis Stigmata event, right? So this is the event where St. Francis in 1200s has this, it looks like a contact event with one of these aerial phenomena things. And so what happens is that, it gets represented in art. And so they go there and they take pictures and they send them back to me and they say, "Oh, Dr. Pasulka, look, there's a UFO in the Louvre," right? And I say to them, "Wait a minute, your grandmother will call that an angel, right? Your
Hmm.
grandmother looks at that and sees an angel. You look at that and see a UFO, because now we look at it and see a UFO thanks to ancient aliens and things like that, right?"
So true. People's
Yeah.
perception of events is so skewed.
Hmm.
And I experienced this firsthand with this podcast. I get so much mail from listeners, and a lot of times listeners will say that I said something in the interview that is I never said it in the interview they just listened to, because they're hearing my words and they're ascribing to them something else. This is so common. We know this, so much more people are so much more educated on this because of all the crime documentaries and stuff like that, they see that witnesses are really not as reliable as we tend to think that they are. So when you went down this road, what was your working assumption and understanding of unidentified anomalous phenomena, as we now have been taught to call them, and the UFO community? And what is your view of this phenomenon and this community and the story here? What's really going on today?
Yes, this is a really great question because I personally had a lot of assumptions and stereotypes about UFOs and the UFO communities. I call them citizen scholars, basically. We call them ufologists. People who maybe have seen a UFO and decided to, go all in researching it. Um, and, I really didn't believe at all, disparaged even, the idea of UFOs. Well, immediately upon entry into this study, I recognized that a lot of the people who have these experiences, they're being studied by people other than like people in my field in religious studies. We do study this type of thing. We call them new religious movements. But what happened was I started to meet people from like the CIA and the FBI and scientists even from the best universities in our country. And they were also following these people around and studying them, right? And I thought, this is so strange. So it really started to erode a lot of the ideas I had about what UFOs and UAPs are. I'd known people who'd seen them, but I didn't ask them about them. I started to ask them, tell me about that UFO you told me you saw a couple years ago. I started to really start to understand that this was actually something that was happening. And my book was written between the years 2012 and
American
2018.
Cosmic.
Yes,
That's
that's
your
right.
first book.
American
Your
Cosmic.
first
Yep,
book on this subject. The one that you've just published is titled Encounters.
that's right. So the first book I published, that research was done previous basically to this idea that where the government has come out and acknowledged again that it's been studying secretly UFOs, UAPs this whole time since the 1940s. And this is called the Pentagon Report that came out in 2021. So my book was a research deep dive into the communities that are now called the legacy communities that do study this. So what happened was I met people in those programs that actually were doing this secretive study, but I didn't have any language because it was secret, right? So I really didn't have the language to talk about them. I didn't know they were called legacy programs. I was really surprised to find out that our government was studying this. I was
Let me understand something there, and I want you to maintain that train of thought. But when you say you didn't have the language, in other words, is what you're saying that you were independently sourcing these people who were independently working on stuff, and you didn't really understand how it fit into the broader picture? Is that what you mean? And that since a lot of the stuff that has come out in the New York Times and other places, that you now have a more appropriate language to actually understand what it was that at that time you were researching?
Yes, that's exactly right. So I was almost like I was a rogue parallel researcher. And I had independently come upon these programs and these people who were doing crash retrieval, what they call crash retrieval work. And in fact, my book opens in New Mexico, where I'm not a believer, but I'm accompanying a man I met through. He works for the Space Force, the United States Space Force. He's had an illustrious career as a mission controller, and he said his hobby was studying UFOs, right? And he said that the next breakthroughs were going to come through my field in that. Now, I honestly just didn't believe him. I thought that maybe
Is this
he
Tyler
was,
D that you're referring to?
yeah, I call him Tyler D because to me it represented a Fight Club scenario. Tyler D in reference to the book and the movie Fight Club is, the first rule is not to talk about it. So he couldn't actually, within his where he worked, including NASA and those places, he worked at a couple of those places. They wouldn't talk about this research at all. And so it was a really strange environment. And so I happened upon it and learned a lot because he and I began to research together, basically. So we spent years doing this research, and I learned about these communities. And at first, when I went to do, academic scholarship, which is going to conferences and talking to your colleagues about what you're studying, a lot of my colleagues were like perplexed. They were like, Diana, what has happened? Like you are such a great researcher. You were being fooled by these people. And I said, no, I am not. I vetted them. These people are very legitimate. They have these credentials. They do this work. One of the scientists I went with to New Mexico, and by the way, when we were in New Mexico, we were supposedly at a UFO crash site. Now, again, I didn't believe it. This was in 2016 or 17. I did not believe it. But
you went now, just again for listeners, in your first book, American Cosmic, the pseudonym for Tyler D was Tyler D, and for Gary Nolan, who subsequently sort of came out of the shadows, and you actually use his actual name in your second book. His name was James in this story, and you went together. And tell people a little bit. I mean, Gary Nolan's a great example because if you didn't know who he was, you could have the same impression that you have about this guy Tyler D. But Gary's a really established guy. I mean, these people live double lives essentially. They are in their, they're mild-mannered, Clark Kents who run teams at Stanford and work on, I forget exactly what Gary's specialty is, but like these are impressive people that are widely regarded, are investors, lead investments in some cases. And then on the side time, they are the people that you write about in your book.
Yes, that was exactly what was so shocking to me was that, Gary Nolan is one of the top researchers in the world of, he does genetic research and he's a microbiologist. And I think he has 3 labs at Stanford University. And he's one of the top producing grant winners there. He's just, he's top of his game. And he's going with me. I asked him to go with me actually, because I knew he was interested in the study of this. And then you have Tyler D, who has to remain pseudonymous because of his work, but he's as amazing as Gary Nolan is. And by the way, Gary Nolan came out as himself about a year and a half ago or 2 years ago.
Yeah, so you guys went to this supposed crash site. Now, you found some materials that Tyler D showed you guys. The obvious reaction that any skeptic would have is, well, maybe Tyler put them there. So my question is, in this particular example, and we don't necessarily have to spend too much time here because there's so much here that I want to cover. In this particular example, what is it that you found? And irrespective of who put it there, what is that material? What do we know about the material that you found, and where can people learn more about it?
Right. Okay. So we did find material, and the idea that Tyler was, if I can just say a bit about the material being put there. Yeah, I thought that, once I began the study of UFOs, I recognized that the government had run a disinformation campaign, in the 1950s through the 60s, and that most likely I was being targeted to disinform, to be a disinformant, not willingly or knowingly, just, but I didn't look, this is how I looked at it. I thought, I'm going to basically say this in the book so that, this book was an academic book for academics. And I was basically saying, this is the rise of a new form of religion. So if it's based on disinformation, this is something we need to know. And so that was part of my data, was the question of whether this was disinformation or not. So I definitely have a whole section on that in there. Now, what's interesting is that we did find things there that, in my opinion, couldn't have been put there because, we spent all day, Gary was like putting his hands down these rocks and, like digging and finding these things. We had metal detectors that were configured by Tyler to specifically look for this type of metal. And
this is a famous crash site that happened years and years ago.
It is, but people...
And it's not Roswell.
No, it's not Roswell. So apparently this is what Tyler D told me, was that there were crashes that happened And there were maybe like 4 of them or something, and there were these different places other than Roswell. And that was just part of the mythology that I was, tapping into. I didn't
Mhm.
have to believe it or disbelieve it. I was recording it because I thought we are at the beginning of a new form of religion, and this is it, and it starts here in New Mexico. So it made a lot of sense to me as a scholar of religion. I wasn't believing or disbelieving. I was mostly disbelieving, frankly,
Mhm.
at that point. But what happened was that, yeah, we did find this material, and Tyler then predicted that we were going to get stopped through the airport. I told Gary, you take the material. I don't want anything to do with it. And so he said, sure. So we all went back to the airport the next day. And sure enough, exactly what Tyler said. And by the way, Tyler is a person who could just go through airports without having to be searched or anything. He has
Mhm.
this like some seemingly amazing ability just to kind of go anywhere he wants. So he went through and he was waiting for us, and we went through the way, that most people go through airports. And yeah, he did get stopped, and we waited, and then he took it back and he did analysis on the parts. Um, from there, the story I don't intentionally follow it, because now what happens is that the United States is looking for this crash retrieval debris, and they want it, and they want to study it.
Well, I
And
think I,
so
I think I've seen. Am I mistaken that I've seen Gary? I've seen Gary in lots of places of being interviewed. I also believe I saw him being interviewed on 60 Minutes, where they went to his lab. Was it 60 Minutes that they interviewed him? They went to his lab. They showed the machinery that he uses to investigate the molecular structure of this material. I mean, like, and from what I didn't spend too much time on it because it's overwhelming the amount of stuff that you have to like look at to try to get your head around this story. But it sounded like he was saying we don't really understand how this material was made, and it's not naturally forming on Earth.
yes, that's true. So
So
yes, that's
people
what
hear that,
yeah,
it's just another example. Of, like, I heard that, but it's like I can't process this information right now. And again, I think it was 60 Minutes, but it was something reputable like that. So it's like some reputable source is having Gary Nolan on from his lab in Stanford telling me that he's got physical material whose molecular structure is neither natural nor derived from Earth, it must have been created, and maybe it was created by some one on Earth, but we've never seen anything like it before. I didn't really understand it, and there are a lot of instances like this. So maybe this is actually a good time, Diana, because it's so important for me to do my very best to try and help people grab onto something here that they can hold on to and begin
sure,
to make their way through this subject. As I said, when I started down this road of preparing for this conversation, again, I've kind of delved in different places on the UAP story and UFO story, but like this is the first time that I sat down and I was like, all right, I'm just gonna sit down for a week and I'm gonna spend as much time as I need to try and absorb as much information as possible. And yes, I read your books, but I also watched interviews by Jacques Vallée. Gary Nolan interviews, lots of other people. I watched a documentary called The Phenomenon. I watched Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I did all sorts of stuff to try and take myself down this rabbit hole. And it is overwhelming, right? It's an
yeah.
overwhelming experience. And
Mhm.
so, like, let me ask you, this would be the way I would ask the question. What are the most important facts about the entire history of this phenomenon up to the present moment that people need to understand in order to have a working framework for what we're talking about here? Whether we're talking about Roswell, whether we're talking about ATIP, or the UAP task force, like what are the important things to help people understand, like, what is this thing we're talking about here?
Right. Okay. So I know it is overwhelming, and I don't dispute that. And it's shocking. I was shocked for a whole year when I started to do this study, when I recognized that, what you were just talking about, the implications of it are amazing. And yeah, it was really transformed my life, basically. I think it has to transform people's lives, because it's that strange. So I just attended a meeting at Stanford. It was actually a conference, and it was for Gary's organization. He's created an organization to study this, and he actually talked about, excuse me, the results of some of the study. By the way, it's really expensive to do that study. So for one group of studies, it it costs a lot of money to use those machines that he has, and he's looking at the molecular structure. And what you said is true. He said, I this looks to be intelligently designed. I don't know where it's from, because it looks like it couldn't have been engineered here on Earth. So these are some of the conclusions that he's come to.
See, that's wild. Just sitting here, and I know what's going to happen, because it's what happens to me. Someone listens to that, it doesn't compute, right? Because again, something else is missing. Wait, what? How is that possible? How does this fit into the larger sort of narrative? Like, that's sort of what I'm asking, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you know, I mean, that's about, so what happened then after we did those studies, because I was still working with Tyler and Gary, is that all of this happened at the level of the government. Then there was this very fast rollout of information about UFOs and UAPs right after my book was published. And it was amazing to me, because I knew that this would happen, but I didn't know it would happen so fast. I mean, I honestly thought it was going to be 20 years or something as this was going to happen, because I thought, well, now that somebody like Gary is doing this analysis, we know that the government's been doing this analysis, so this information has to be coming out somehow. And it came out in ways in which I was really shocked by. I was really shocked to hear David Grush talk about these programs. I was really shocked to hear him talk about the very physicality of it, bordering on the absolute ridiculous, right? I mean, it just seems so.
David ran the task force, the UAP task force. He was charged with overseeing that by Congress. What was his
okay,
role?
so he was a person who was doing an investigation into these programs.
But he had congressional authority to do it, right? What was the what was the authority under which he was doing that, or the organization that he was leading?
Well, he was supposed to do that through, actually, I don't know what the authority is. It was congressional. He was supposed to basically update Congress about what his findings were.
Yeah.
And what his findings were was that there were these programs where people were actively engaged in the, sourcing of crash retrievals and the study of.
And he claimed that there was also, David, under congressional testimony, claimed that they also found biological material.
That's what he said.
Foreign biological material.
Yeah, that's what he said.
Yeah. And then something else happened also, where like he was being prevented from actually sharing some of this in public testimony. So maybe you can illuminate us on that a little bit too. Like what's the kind of, because this also, as a skeptic, because I'm sort of on both sides of this issue, right? There's so many reasons why dismissing this is unsatisfactory. All of this, just unsatisfactory. But it's also like there are reasons why accepting it is also unsatisfactory. And like this is a good example where like this guy's testifying. He's supposedly been granted, he's been tasked by Congress to figure out what's going on. And then there's this giant controversy. He testifies before Congress, but then he's not allowed to say certain things. And a lot of skeptics will be like, this is all bullshit. This is some like government psyop or some press thing, or who knows what it is. This is just, it's too much smoke. Where are the facts? If this guy's supposed to be investigating it, why is it so hard? So what exactly happened in this sort of task force? Because he recently was on Joe Rogan, and I watched the entire interview, and I have to say that, like, again, I don't rely on just my assessments of whether someone is credible or not credible. He seemed like, I'm very hard on people when it comes to whether they're credible or not. He seemed pretty credible, but he also, like, there's tons of things per usual with all these people that he can't say. He's not allowed to say. So what is really going on here?
Yeah. Okay. So the way I look at it, and I agree with you. First, you have to understand that, there's been a long history of disinformation from our government about this topic. Okay, so let's just acknowledge it and not be naive. Okay, and I think that skepticism is absolutely warranted. However, I was an independent scholar who found evidence of these things, these programs. Did I find evidence of actual presence of UFOs, like kind of extraterrestrial? What Gary Nolan has found evidence of is material that's been engineered that doesn't look like it was engineered by us on Earth. Okay. So let's just take it step by step slowly. Okay. Because if we don't, that's when it's going to, well, actually, believe it or not, that's when we get the new forms of religion that we see, you know, kind of swirling around. And I think we have to be really careful about that, to tell you the truth. I suggest that we become very, like you are, skeptical and sober, and just take it step by step. Right now, a lot of other countries don't have the same history with UFOs that we do. So say in Brazil, the military studies it. In Peru, they look at this and they're like, yeah, we had, you know, the pilots see these things and we don't know what they are. They're unknowns. But it doesn't get to the point of the carnivalesque, you know, flavor that seems to permeate the issue here in the United States. And I don't think it really has to. And so we have to question, why is that happening? So, you know, that's one of the things that I look at is like, why does it really have to be so ridiculous? You know? Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, that is an interesting avenue of conversation. The other thing I want to highlight again, because this is, I guess this is part of my process of coming to terms with what it is that we're talking about here. I've met so many people that swear to me that they've seen a UFO. And by the way, most of those conversations I've had with random strangers have happened in like that whole Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona area, which is another sort of weird thing. And I'm curious about, but it's not just that all of the stuff that's come out from the government is difficult to dismiss, including like some of the most compelling stuff is those videos from pilots, right? Like of
Yes.
objects that they've captured. I mean, most people, you can maybe just kind of summarize that for anyone that doesn't know, but that stuff's wild. And that came out, when was that? 2017. But it's
Yes.
also the number of individuals who claim to have seen things in the sky that were clearly not planes. And it's not just that they make the claims, and you document this in your book, it's the way that their lives change afterwards. Jacques Vallée has documented this as well. It's, again, these things are very difficult to dismiss. I have a very sort of pointed question here, because we talked about Gary for a while now, and again, AKA James in American Cosmic. Gary has stated publicly that he believes contact has already happened and that it's ongoing. When he says that it's ongoing, does he mean that non-human intelligence, that he believes that non-human intelligence, that this phenomenon that is intelligent and presumably more intelligent than us, is influencing the social organization of humans on Earth through our governments, for example?
I'm pretty sure that's what he means. And I say that only because I know him and I've known him for several years. So I believe that
That's wild.
there are, you know, part of what I did in the second book, kind of the follow-up to American Cosmic, is Encounters. And what I did was I focused on really credible experiencers. And some of them, well, a lot of people that I interviewed were people from indigenous cultures who basically say, yeah, this has been a tradition in our culture for, you know, 20,000 years, and we've kept it through oral traditions, and we have contact, and we, you know, this is what we know about it. But we have, it's usually through initiation into different ways of learning about this contact with what they would call, you know, non-human intelligence. So yeah, so a lot of people believe that different cultures have been in contact, and then some people say, well, what you call NHI, non-human intelligence, for people in religion, they already believe in that. They already have an epistemological category for belief in non-human intelligences, right? So in different religions. So in that sense, you could say yes.
Right,
That's,
but that
you know,
there is a fundamental difference here, and that actually raises a really interesting point. But there's a fundamental difference here between the alien encounter, as we talked about in the early stages, and what you talked about in your book as well, which is that there's also an empirical layer to this, which is that it isn't just that you have faith in God. You're actually out there investigating, looking for physical evidence of
yes,
this
absolutely.
phenomenon.
That makes the big difference. That's my point exactly. Which is why I was basically saying in my field, I was saying we are just about to see a religion get real,
So
literally.
yeah, so look, again, there's so many parts of the story. Let's just follow a little bit more on what we were just talking about with what Gary said. So one of the things that I thought about, and I think this is just a natural thing that everyone thinks about when they deal with this kind of a subject, is explanations. What framework, what needs to change in my framework of the world in order to accommodate the evidence that we have here, right? So what are some possible explanations? What else in your view needs to be true in order for these things that you're talking about today to be true? So for example, we're talking about you know, being in contact with non-human intelligence that influences the social structures of society. What is hard for me to understand, and I think for a lot of people, and this also speaks to like the structure of government, like how does government work? This whole story really stresses people's implicit understanding of how government operates, where power resides in institutional Washington, because here you have David Grush empowered by Congress to get to the bottom of this, and somehow he's being thwarted. And I hear, you know, in the process of, and I told you this too when I read your book, it was like reading a stereogram, right? It was like staring, you know, those stereograms are those images people don't know that are two-dimensional, but you have to stare at them the right way, let your eyes loosen the right way, and all of a sudden you see three-dimensional images just pop up. And there's a quality in which reading through your research and your work and the work of other people requires that kind of just subtle shift in perspective in order to understand what it is that we're looking at here. So like in the process of doing this, it seems like there's some kind of, and you write about this too, there's almost like a mystic cult, like a sort of Gnostic tradition, like the Eleusinian mysteries in cults in Greece, that is sort of has some knowledge, some kind of proprietary knowledge about this thing that we're talking about. And these people, this is a cult, this is a kind of religious thing, this is something, and this network of people is grafted on top of the intelligence communities, the military industrial complex, et cetera. There are people from this sort of society, the secret society, that exist in all sort of different areas of power, and they are so powerful and that they are thwarting the attempts of the sort of institutions to try and understand what's going on here. And furthermore, it seems that one of the working theories is that the government doesn't actually control these programs. It's private contractors who control them on behalf of certain government agencies. So it's like it's not really a clear chain of command issue here. So like how, you know, feel free to respond to that however you like. How does that track with your understanding of what is being alleged here or what is going on?
I'd give you an A for reading the book well. That's what I would give you, you know, a high score, 100. So yeah, that tracks well with something that I didn't expect to find at all. And let me give you a little example of this. So I'm in a group of people who are researching a topic, and we just let in a new person into this group, and he's an analytic philosopher, and well known. So he's very intelligent. And I was explaining a little bit about, he really wants the data, right? He says, where do we get the data? Where do we get the data? You know, and he goes, come on, everyone. We've been looking at this stuff for 70 years or so. Like, where, you know, where can we find it? And my point has been that the data wasn't written down. The data is in the bodies of the people who keep this information and do this study. And they learned how to do this. Like, you know, if you go back again, this comes from field like anthropology and religious studies. If you look at some indigenous cultures, you see that they have knowledge that, you know, is very, very, very old, right? How did they keep that knowledge? Well, they have a very sophisticated oral tradition. And so I explained to him that there was an oral tradition within these communities of people who do this study. And he scoffed at it. And he said, I'm not talking about what people pass in, the water cooler, the water cooler talk where people are just, and I was insulted because no, I'm not talking about that either. You're missing the point that the reason why they keep it this way is because when those people die, that data dies. So they hand it off, and it takes years and years. Tyler couldn't find a person to succeed him, and he's in this group, and he couldn't find somebody who was able to take the information and, that person needs to be a certain person. And when I knew him, and I don't now, when I knew him, they were in the process of locating that successor so that he could give the data to that person, and that person they hadn't found yet.
See, that is so fascinating because that is so illuminating too, to understand that in parallel to the sort of much more investigatable phenomena that we're talking about here and the sort of traditional channels of understanding, that there's also this kind of cult. Again, I don't mean it I'm not ascribing a sort of moral value to it, though I will say that at times there are parts of this that feel somewhat satanic. And I'm happy to sort of get into my interpretation of that in the second hour. But beside that, there is this kind of cult, and understanding the role that oral tradition plays in it, I think really helps fill in some gaps in terms of how it is that information is shared, how things are talked about. Again, to this point about it feeling like you're looking at a stereogram, and you have to adjust the way that you look at this thing in order to understand it. And I think there is a pathway to doing that that also doesn't lead you down the road of losing the plot. You know what I mean? Which is, I think, what I've often felt is happening with this subject. So, Diana, I'm going to move the rest of our conversation onto the second hour. I want to talk to you about, again, I want to investigate this particular phenomenon further and what this tells us about actually how it is that, what is the structure of government? How does this system operate exactly? What does this tell us about it? And quite frankly, our perception of our ability as a public to have an influence over the power structure. And I also I'm happy to kind of go a little into sort of what feels like a little uncomfortable land, because
Okay.
I feel like you need to do that. And I did it in preparation for this when I was asking, like, what else needs to be true? So we talk about Gary's view that, that there is already like some kind of ongoing contact between this kind of intelligence and social hierarchical power structures in society today. I think it's also useful for people to understand that, like, the reason why the term UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena, which used to be actually unidentified aerial phenomena, came into widespread use is because in so many ways our perception of what this thing is informed by media, as we talked about earlier, in terms of like how people come to believe things. And that is not very helpful if you're trying to really understand what this sort of broader phenomena is. But I want to talk about that. And I also want to talk about the social impacts of all of this, how it is exactly that this is becoming a religion and the implications of that. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Diana, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Diana, stick around. We're going to move the rest of this wild conversation onto the premium feed.
Sounds great.